I'm Randy, that's Anissa. I feel like you guys are both, you know us, so I won't spend a ton of time there. Let's dig into our outcomes for today and where we want to go. We are a smaller group today, so if you want to unmute yourself at any time and ask questions, please feel free to do so. It's going to be a more casual of a presentation than they sometimes can be, so please feel free to pipe up and ask questions and have a chat with us whenever you like. Our three objectives today are to define closure as part of the lesson cycle. We want to be able to identify criteria for deciding whether to design those closures to happen for synchronous instruction. So when we have kids face-to-face, whether that's in the classroom or over the computer screen, or asynchronous, so whether they're not next to us or across the screen from us, and identify some strategies for making that closure really work for us as well. We'll begin here and end on time. Just as we always do, we are scheduled here till 4:30 today, but probably with a smaller group, we'll probably move a little lighter, a little faster, unless our conversations go a little deeper. So we'll see how that goes, but we will honor that time. Please stay focused and be respectful here as we engage in those conversations. Please assume positive intent as we all come and share our stories. Please chat with us and mute the microphone when not speaking as well. As I said, because we're a smaller group, we'll have a lot of space for you to unmute and add some thinking to the room as well, so please do that. Share those questions, keep back channeling, keep chatting with us. We will answer those questions as we can, and hopefully we'll be able to get to everything you have a question about here over the next hour or so. We will save any chatting to allow us to follow up on any unanswered questions or comments and get some big ideas together for you. So we'll start here with our welcome and warm-up. Our warm-up asks you to think about your recent experience, whether that's you in the classroom or thinking about recent classrooms that you have visited or otherwise. What are some examples of effective closures that you have used, seen, or experienced? Please take a moment to just think about that. I see some of us are working in Pear Deck, some of us are not. If you're not working Pear Deck, feel free to open up, just use the chat feature here in Zoom, and it should be easy enough for us to track.
This is Karen. I haven't seen anything, so I work in the curriculum department, so I'm just trying to get all the information, see how it works. So this is what I'm supposed to be passing on. So I'm curious to see what other people have to share that have seen it and used it as well.
Okay. Thank you. We'll give some folks some time to complete their responses, and then we will move forward. Okay, so some closures we've seen are exit tickets that ask students to summarize their learning or ask questions about the lesson. Otherwise, we ask students to reflect on the learning in some way, shape, or form. We see from Felicia in the chat that exit tickets have also been effective. So that's really a key way we can close our lessons. And as we go, it's certainly a tried and true strategy, and there's a reason it's so popular. As we go forward throughout the session, hopefully we'll find some ways to add some variety to that, especially given the remote context we find ourselves in. Many of us find ourselves in at this point in the year. So we'll clarify our terms. We know here that on the call here, we have very experienced educators, but we want to make sure we're speaking the same language because everyone has their own little flavor of lesson planning that they bring to the table. So the lesson cycle we typically talk about starts with that hook and moves into the new learning. And for those of you working with gradual release model, that's the I do. We then talked about guided practice a little bit later in the series, that we do phase where we have an opportunity to work together with students. A more recent session talked about independent practice in the you do phase. And then we have our closures, which is where we'll spend in time today. So the closure, really briefly, is in face-to-face. We know that's typically done at the end of those learning episodes. So at the end of a class session in a multi-day lesson, we'll have that little check-in or activity, that little reflection. At the end of a multi-day lesson, we'll have a check-in or reflection activity that asks them to at the end of a single day lesson, we'll have that reflection activity that asks them to reflect and summarize their learning and think about where they are. Often used as a formative assessment. In remote context, though, it tends to be its own learning episode. Especially as we think about asynchronous learning, we really think about that the asynchronous learning tends to be a list of activities, right? We have a separate activity for each of the phases of the learning cycle. And so this tends to be its own distinct thing that students either have to log into or submit an assignment for, and that can make it feel a little bit differently. But no matter whether we are face-to-face or remote, there's 4 big umbrellas that those closure questions or closure activities can fall into, and those are application exercises, reflection questions, summarization questions, or metacognition questions. We know throughout the series of webinars here that we've gone through in the fall, we've talked a bit about application, reflection, and summarization. So we really want to spend a lot of time within this session talking about metacognition and thinking about some strategies that really make it work for kids, especially in the remote setting. We know, though, that as we go forward and make decisions, your professional judgment is going to be tested this year in ways that it hasn't been before. We know we've led every session this fall with that, but the point bears repeating in that no one has really transitioned public education or any public education system to a fully online environment or even a hybrid environment. And there's not a lot of research basis to guide us in what that looks like. So a lot of it's going to be our professional gut that we have to trust about what's best for our kids and what decisions we're going to make for how this learning works. So we can make some recommendations here, but certainly what we recommend may not be best for your individual scenarios. As we've talked throughout the series and the different portions of the lesson cycle, we've talked about this idea of a good match and better match. We know that everything we do in the classroom is a good match for part of the lesson cycle because that's the way we've been doing it for hundreds of years, right? But now that we have remote learning and asynchronous learning as an option to us, it becomes incumbent upon us to weigh more heavily and more carefully where certain activities are going to take place, whether they're going to take place in person with students across a computer screen from us or in our virtual classroom meetings, or whether they're going to happen asynchronously when they're offline from us. So when we think about closures, we think that's a good match for this portion of the lesson cycle. And we think about it's a rationale. The rationale behind that is we want to have that final summary or demonstration is essential and immediately necessary to gain confidence in student readiness. So if there is a lab exercise or a science experiment that we want to put a bow on here as part of our learning, really giving them to do that follow-up right then and there can be really helpful. Or again, showing that final demonstration of a math problem in class can be really helpful to get a really good sense of where our kids are and what next steps we might need to take. We also could have students create that written audio or visual summary as we look at the examples down below. They could create a written audio or visual demonstration of the skill using some apps we'll explore a little bit later on. And they will also of course, respond to those written audio, visual, or reflective prompts. When we think about asynchronous learning, when kids aren't necessarily with us, either in virtual space or in our classroom spaces, closures can tend to be a better match for that, because many digital media that are available to us lend themselves well to summarizing and reflecting, and that speaks not only just to media, but to apps that are available to us as well. We might ask them to engage in the same kinds of thinking, whether they're engaged in that summary, whether they're demonstrating their skills, or they're recording or responding to written audio or visual reflective prompts. But when we think about the limited time we have available to us in those synchronous sessions, the closure is an activity where the students don't typically need a lot of guidance from us. And so that can more readily be completed in an asynchronous setting. So as we think about our session here and think about that little piece, if you will, of weighing the costs and benefits of closures in in synchronous and asynchronous learning, we want to stop and jot with this question, either in Pear Deck or in chat, or feel free to unmute yourself as well. In remote learning, a lesson closure is often its own learning episode. in what ways might that change how we design them? Please write in Pear Deck, write in chat, or wherever seems good to you. We'll give you another moment or two to put the finishing touches on your responses there. And let's see what the room is thinking. So sometimes exit ticket prompts happen on the fly, right? They're good. They can sometimes happen in the middle of the lesson that because maybe we didn't get as far as we wanted to, or we went farther than we were going to, right? That exit ticket prompt can be really at the top of our head. But if that closure happens after that synchronous session, as the first person points out here, it does require some more thought and care on our parts. And of course, apps provided different avenues for us to respond with as well. Certainly, there's that technology piece, right? If we're asking students to respond electronically, we need to teach them how to do that. And that's true in the first 4 portions of the lesson cycle, but it's also true about our closure as well, especially if we're using an app that's different for them in this case. There's a case, again, for being more selective, and also as well about thinking about how we give the students an opportunity to think. So many times we walk into classrooms, this happened before school closures, where the teacher would do the summary at the end of class saying, here's what we learned today and here's why it's important. And so this really resonates with me, whoever brought that up. When the teacher does that thinking, we kind of take that away from the kids. We take that opportunity away from the kids. So an asynchronous closure forces us to have kids do that thinking on their own, forces them to reflect, forces them to do that summarization. And so that's probably maybe a hidden benefit of this, having to think about closures in this way. So thank you for sharing those, and please keep that thinking coming in Pear Deck and in chat. So as we talked about earlier, there's a few different big umbrellas that closure prompts and closure exercises can fit into, but we want to spend today really digging into metacognition and how we get students thinking about their thinking. Our rationale for choosing that as our focus for closures is because as they're looking independently, they're going to need to think about their own work habits and think about how they can best act and study and learn in ways that best fits them. And so really helping them foster those metacognition skills. Is this working for me? What can I do next time? Is going to be huge for us, not only in regular day-to-day instruction, but especially during remote instruction to help them build some of those capacities while they're more independent than perhaps we are used to them being. So we'll talk about 3 big strategies for metacognition and show a few examples of each. These come from the work of Fisher, Frey, and Everlove from 2009, and we'll talk about self-monitoring questionnaires and show some examples of each. We'll talk about learning logs and see how that might work in a variety of levels, as well as peer conversations, how kids can talk with each other to engage in some of that metacognition and do some problem solving and reflection. First, we want to model one of those self-questionnaires for you. And while many of the strategies we'll talk about today are focused really on kids and what they're doing, we also know that many of us on the call are tasked with supporting adult learners. And engaging them in metacognition and a good sense of how they're doing is also important. So that's what we're going to ask you to do now, is to depict yourself as a superhero using Pear Deck's drawing features. You can add whatever you want to for the figurine there. You also notice that in the drawing tools, you'll have a text box prompt, so you can respond to the 3 questions there on the right. you can tell us a little bit about your origin story. So how have you transformed into a superhero over the past 6 months since school closures were announced? What are your new superpowers? What strengths and abilities have you gained as you turn into this superhero here? And what's your kryptonite? What are some areas of growth that you might want to attend to here in the next few days, weeks, or months? So please do a moment to engage in, please take a moment to engage in some metacognition on your own, and we'll move forward from there. As I look at some of your drawings, some of you appear to be grateful that we provided an outline today. And we know we're asking you to do a lot here on this particular slide, so we'll give you a few moments to go ahead and get that thinking out there. To be fully transparent, I have a second device going here over to my right, so I'm able to peek in on what some of us are working on here. And give you just another moment or two to finalize that thinking. Okay, so as we get ready to move forward, you'll feel free to keep adding to your depictions here. I'll go ahead and show a few of them. We don't necessarily need you to go ahead and talk about anything that you wrote specifically, but we do want you to think about as you read as you look at some of these descriptions here and some of what we've put together. I want you to think a little bit about how an activity like this might benefit your adult learners. What is a multitasking is definitely happened here, right? As you think about your work in supporting adult learners, because for those of you that are here live with us on the call, that is the role that we serve in, how might activities like this be helpful? So feel free to either unmute or leave some thinking in our chat box, please. How might activities like this be helpful for you as you support adult learners?
I don't know about everybody else, but one of the things that I find really helpful for me as I support the adults is being able to model what they possibly could use in their own classroom. Because if they can feel it as a student, then we can also not only do whatever learning we're doing as adults, but it's that two-tier, the two hats at the same time, the learner as well as the practitioner, and really think about what does that look like in my classroom, and do a lot of troubleshooting, because that's where we're at more than anything, is troubleshooting look like. What's the friction, how are kids going to be able to navigate that, to navigate multiple things at once? How am I going to navigate multiple things at once? So I think that's really a good way to use this, as well as any other type of app or strategy that gets people to really think about their own thinking, about their own practice.
Mm-hmm. Felicia in the chat tells us that it would give us some information about where they are and how they're feeling about their current reality, which is a great snapshot. What I inferred there is also we could probably do perhaps not the same activity over and over again, because that might give us some negative results, right? But if we were to have similar activities where we were checking in over time, that would enable us to see how our journey is progressing as we go forward. So thank you for sharing those ideas. Anything else that we would like to be shared? Okay. Let's talk about some of those student strategies as well. One thing we can do as we're talking about self-monitoring questionnaires is for our lower level students, we can give them something as simple as this, right? If we ask them to rate the degree to which they understood the goal for their work, we ask them to rate the degree to which they achieved that goal, and whether or not they could teach someone else about that goal. That gives us a pretty good barometer about their level of understanding and their level of comfort and confidence with what it is they've been learning. So that's a great way for us to provide, or a great tool for us to provide to students, a great data collection point for us to gather from them. And certainly their responses here could guide us in telling us who we might need to have another follow-up conference call with, or follow-up email with, to help make them feel a little bit better and help understand what where they're feeling those gaps at. We can also ask them about some of their behaviors, and we can be a little more task specific with that. So we can ask them whether or not they reached their learning goal for the week. I think we can ask them about specific behaviors. When they're confused about something, do they ask peers or teachers for support? And if they disagree with that, well, that's a pretty good indicator that we need to have a conversation with them about some of their habits of mind and some of their beliefs, right? About who they can ask for support and how comfortable they feel in our classrooms. And certainly if we were working at a longer term project, we could ask them about do they feel good about their plan, or do they feel good about their thinking that they've done in getting ready to execute that project? So all of those are different prompts we could ask our kids and get some information from them. We also know that our students need help, especially in this remote setting, need help examining some of their own thought processes and their work habits, as well as we try to instill some of those effective habits and practices in them. So we might have more broad questionnaires or broad questions as part of those questionnaires. So this one, for example, says, you finished a day of face-to-face learning and go home. You are practicing and previewing for your classes, but there is always something else you want or have to do, so they quit studying when they think they've studied enough. How do you know you're ready for those classes? And so what we found in a lot of our work with student surveys and whatnot is teachers don't often or always make time to have these kinds of conversations with kids, right? But where we can work with kids to build their self-awareness about their study habits, about when they're choosing decisions, or how they're making decisions, to put that extra 10 minutes in and making sure those 10 minutes give us some valuable and productive study time. That can be just as powerful a conversation as reviewing that piece of content for the 4th or 5th time with that student as well, if we can give them the tools to catch their own fish, so to speak. So as we think about those three examples, self-monitoring surveys, and indeed the fourth one that you engaged in as well with your superheroes, what are some potential benefits of assigning self-monitoring questionnaires to students? Please feel free to either drop some thinking in chat or type in Pear Deck if you are able. Okay. As you finish up those responses, we'll look at the first few of them. First of all, it gives us a temperature check on how students are feeling about their learning. And certainly those feelings and that thinking gives us a lot of insight into what adjustments we might need to make to help them feel more confident. They become more aware of their strengths and weaknesses. They check their own understanding. And we can also use these surveys like these to design some differentiated activities as well. If we have groups of students we know that aren't feeling very confident, that might be a group that needs more intensive intervention and oversight from us, or whether it's a small group conferencing. We might also conversely pair low confidence students with highly confident students to have them share some ideas going back and forth. So certainly it's another data point we can use to help us guide our instruction as they respond to those questions.
And to add to that, one of the things that I was also thinking about as I was looking at what everybody else said is that idea of, just like we do reading strategies to help kids know how to be a good reader, and we do those think alouds to help kids know the thought process, how to do that type of thinking or problem solving correctly. To me, that self-assessment, like that self-monitoring piece is the same thing. It's like, how do we help kids know a really positive way to reflect on their strengths and to reflect on the areas that they're not doing so good at. We're always saying we want to set goals for kids, but oftentimes those are some big things, and we do that in advisory or through the counseling office. And this is that small piece, of really looking at the weekly or the daily target and goal setting for, here's where I'm doing really well and I understand it, and here's where I'm not quite understanding it, or I don't feel like I'm understanding it.
Thank you, right? Certainly we can use these for goal setting, and certainly compare how we're feeling week over week or day over day. And if we tend to trend in the right direction, that's probably a good thing. We're closer to meeting that goal. And if we're trending in directions that say we're less confident in our skills or abilities, that warrants a different kind of conversation with that student. The second tool we want to talk with you about today comes to us from the medical field, and Fisher and Frey's work with some of their colleagues there. It's a learning log. In fact, my mother-in-law is a nurse educator, and she uses learning logs with the nurses she supervises in the field as well. And the important part here is the questions you see coming down the left, and on the right-hand side, we see examples of some response to those questions. But where my mother-in-law and indeed other medical educators use these is to really dig into individual scenarios and think about what happened, what do next as you see, or what you might do next in that situation as you see in the middle of that question set there, and as well as generating some action steps going forward from there. In this particular case, the nurse learned to trust her gut about a misdiagnosed patient, and instead had the patient rush to the emergency room instead. And so the learning was, well, that maybe that shouldn't just be a gut thing. We need to go brush up on some of these diagnoses and look more at symptoms. And hopefully our students don't have that high stakes decisions to make in our classrooms necessarily, but the practice is the same, right? Where we can engage them in some conversation and some thinking about what they learned, what they might do differently, and the action steps, those concrete action steps that will help them remedy that situation. So bringing that back to the K-12 context, one example is we can do this after a daily lesson. What were some of the main ideas from this lesson or this multi-day lesson? What did you understand best? What questions do you still have? And how does this relate to other things you have learned? So certainly we could ask them at the end of the day or at the end of the lesson or at the end of the synchronous or asynchronous session to respond to any or all of those as they reflect on the learning. Learning logs don't have to be necessarily text-based. They can certainly be drawing, and they can be iterative processes as well. So in lower level social studies, and generally first grade, but depending on your state, it can vary and be as high as second grade. One of the key standards that's common among all states is getting to know your neighborhood, working on that mental map. So on week one of that standard, we might have students simply draw a mental map of their state, or of their neighborhood, or of their street, and that's being depicted there in blue here. The next time around, we might ask them to broaden their horizons, both literally and figuratively, by mapping what's a little bit further out in that yellow ring. And still even further, the next time we revisit the map, adding what's in green, so adding things that are a little bit farther away. And certainly that same process, that iterative process, could work for us in other contexts as well. We could start with a very narrow knowledge base in our science courses, but as we go through additional lessons and perhaps do additional modeling or experiments, we can add to a concept map and keep on adding new things and making new connections and really making that thinking and learning visible as we continue to add to that learning log. So it's a running record of the learning, if you will, not necessarily just a written record, but a drawn one in this case. No matter how you choose to implement learning logs, though, there's a lot that separates the learning log from a journal, and it's all in the follow-up that we designed for that. Learning logs are simply not as impactful if we don't plan ahead of time to review those logs across a series of entries, and indeed ask students to review those logs across a series of entries. So we might ask students, for example, to go back to their map here and reflect on that process and what they were able to gain and what new things they learned about their neighborhood, and make connections between the three stages of that making that map to really solidify that learning and help them think about that thinking. We might ask them to conference about a series of entries. So say, for example, we looked at that first written set of questions. What were some of the main ideas? What did you understand best, and what questions do you still have? If after a week or so, or after several sessions, students still have similar questions that are showing up in their learning logs, that's good information for us to know as educators, right? And that's something that might come up in that teacher-student conference about where that student happens to be struggling. So certainly conferencing can be part of it as well. It's also helpful, though, apart from just conferencing, to have students highlight and annotate patterns in their answers over time and reflect. So if they go back over their learning logs every week or every 2 weeks and they see that they have similar questions popping up again, that might be a question that that's nagging at them, and they might feel more compelled to bring forward to us in a conference or in an email or something, or so on and so forth. So the idea is a learning log isn't just a one and done. It's not that I drew my pretty picture and it's there and I'm checking this box to be compliant. It's there to serve as another tool for us to have some conversation about what the student is learning and how they're learning it. So as you think about the learners that you support, whether you're supporting adults or students more directly, what do you see as some possible applications of learning logs in your area? Please feel free to respond in Pear Deck or in chat as you are able. Give it just another moment or so to finish up your responses. And let's see some of that thinking. So certainly we can use it to make our exit tickets connect to each other. So if we continually ask them, what connections do you see to what we talked about yesterday, or what connections do you see to what we talked about the day before or last week? We help them make those connections and keep that previous content fresh in their minds. So that's a great way we can use learning logs to reinforce that learning is an iterative process and that all builds on each other. Certainly we could use it with teachers to reflect on a lesson that was recorded. So we were to go back to a model similar to what we showed from the nurse education in the medical field. That's a great way to diagnose and dissect a lesson that we can talk about teachers with. And also we can generate some cause and effect relationships as well. And again, think about what students are learning and how they're learning that as they are moving forward. So let's move on to our last bit of strategy and talk about peer conversations here. For those of you that have spent some time with us, you know that we see peer conversations as a three-phase ordeal that do take some significant planning. It's not simply a turn and talk. We know there's always student to self time where students have to think about that idea that they're going to bring to the table to share with their peers. We know that we need to have a well-structured and well-planned student-to-student time, so we should have some clearly defined parameters for that conversation to happen in. And we also know that there's going to be some student-to-class time as well. Those groups need to be responsible and accountable for bringing some thinking up to the whole group. That gives them the sense that what I say in my small group matters, that whoever my teacher is or whoever my instructor or facilitator is cares about the work that we do, and it's not just a time for us to just spend some time socializing, but there's a definitive work product, there's a definitive thought that has to come out of this session for us. So certainly we could have our groups engage in metacognition in those small group peer conversations. We could ask those prompts to revolve around things like name something that surprised or confused you. As students are able to share some of that, they get some insight into their classmates' thought patterns. And if chances are, if one of those four people was confused about something, and I pulled four out randomly, but it's a good small group discussion number size. But if someone else in my group is confused about something, perhaps I can help to clarify that with them or for them as we engage in that conversation. We might ask them to connect what we learned today to what we learned in another class. Especially if our students travel together, and they likely are in many of the cohort models that schools nationwide are following, respecting social distancing and so on and so forth. There's going to be a lot of connections and shared experiences they'll be able to make. So they'll be able to connect the Crucible to the Red Scare or whatever the case happens to be, and wherever their learning maps say they are throughout the year. So we might, if we think about more of a task base, so we're thinking about designing a lab or completing a project or whatever the case might be, we could ask them to think about what they might do next time, what they might do a little bit better to prepare. So think about those tips going forward. We might ask them to, again, think about some ideas that worked well for them and ideas that did not as they keep working together. And additionally, we can also just leave it as a celebration. No matter what prompt we ask, though, students to engage with, we need to make sure that there's a structure for that conversation. Otherwise, we know, especially perhaps in an unsupervised breakout room, that conversation can go all kinds of different ways that we might not want it to go. So we certainly want to work before that conversation to establish some ground rules and some norms with our kiddos, making sure that we set some agreements for how we'll disagree and what those disagreements will look like, and that we are separating people from the problem. It might be helpful, especially for those first few conversations, to state and give some examples and criteria of good work. So what should this conversation look and sound like? Perhaps I record a conversation with a few students beforehand, or I grab a few teachers from my department to show them what a good metacognitive conversation looks like, to really model what that that turn taking, that building on each other's comments really should feel like. Certainly we can link metacognition to rubric dimension as well, and if we're going to do that, we should be upfront about that. We could talk a little bit about, part of doing this work as a mathematician is that we want you to grow and reflect and learn problem solving strategies and learn to apply those mathematical practices. And metacognition and thinking about their thinking is another great avenue to do that. Providing sentence stems can also be a helpful source of that structure as well, saying, so students start those conversations with, I hear you, and one thing I agree with that you said is blank, or I disagree with you, and here is why, blank. Really making sure that conversation happens in a safe space and with a safe structure for that. We want to make sure that we have specific time frames allotted for that conversation to happen in. So if we have a 5-minute breakout room and each member has 1 minute, that expectation should be clear to everyone involved. And we should also keep in mind what the overall length and of that conversation might be. And lastly, while this doesn't often happen in metacognitive conversations, the more reflective conversations we're talking about, it can be helpful to assign some roles such as timekeeper or taskmaster or recorder to help us really facilitate the conversation and make sure it works well for us. So the timekeeper might keep an eye on the time, especially if we are breaking out in Google Meets and it doesn't have a built-in timing feature. That timekeeper might be in charge of reminding everyone, hey, we need to go back to the main room here in just a few minutes or come back with us. So where necessary, please do think about assigning those roles and responsibilities to help make sure that conversation goes smoothly. As we move toward the end of our session here, this last point, this last stop and jot, to be honest, is an experiment on our part. We just learned about this particular app smashing here a little bit earlier this week, and we were eager to try it with our crowd this week, or here today. If you click on the link down below, the flipgrid.com/IRRE91520, it'll take you to our Flipgrid page that we have, our group that we designed specifically for this session. If you are with us on a mobile device, whether that is a phone or an iPad or other tablet, it may ask you to download an app in order to record a video response. If you're not already using the app, don't worry. You can feel free to type about it. If you are joining us on a desktop, it should take you right to Flipgrid right away, and you should be able to start recording a response once you've logged in. In either case, you do have the ability to record a response to this question here, and we'll give you some time to play with and experiment with that and ask any tech support questions you might have. But the question we want you to think about is this. Consider one of your first several learning targets for the learners that you support. Of the 3 metacognitive strategies, so questionnaires, learning logs, or peer conversations, which might spark the most helpful growth and reflection? I will stop sharing this screen for a moment and go over to Flipgrid for just a second to be able to help folks out over there, but also please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask any questions you might have about submitting a response. For full disclosure, if we were all in the same place, right, and we were running a true classroom scenario, you might already be members of Flipgrid, and so this integration will work a little bit smoother, a little bit faster. We'll give you some time to dig into Flipgrid, and again, if you have any questions, please let us know before we move forward to close out our day here today.
All right, Randy, so I practiced it.
I You did. I will share my screen over here, and I'll show you. For those of you that are, where'd you go? There you are. So hopefully, clicking on that link should have brought you to a screen that looks a lot like this. It gives you an option to record responses. There's a big red button down here for you guys that will say record responses. You can also do that by clicking on the Actions tab and clicking on Record a Response up here. And Anissa was the first one to share a response here. You are free to view that at your leisure and respond to Anissa and engage in some conversation there. We'll give you another moment or two to figure that out. And if we're feeling a little shy today, or if it's proven to be a technical barrier, we'll move forward here in just a moment anyway.
Yeah, this is definitely one of those practice with your colleagues first, because I realized that I had to make sure I was on mute in Zoom and turn off my camera so that I could use my camera to record in Flipgrid and then, do that. So it wasn't too difficult. And now I'm like, I feel like, oh, I can do this anytime. But that first time is going to be, quite the experiment with the kids or with your teachers. So definitely the more you can do it with the teachers as learners, then they'll feel hopefully a little more confident to do it with the kids.
Right. We'll give you just another moment or two to play with it. And then we will head on to our closure today, just to honor your time for those of us that are here with us live.
And for those of you guys who may not have played around with Flipgrid, it allows you to either have the kids send a video direct to you, or to like what Randy set up, almost like a discussion board, if you will, where they can see each other's and respond. So you can get a really great peer conversations going that way, even though they're asynchronous. The one thing that we tried to do today is one of the things that we've heard from teachers in the field is that idea of trying to not have too many things going on with the kids at once. So if you're using a Google Slide in a synchronous session and you're wanting to use Pear Deck to help with the engagement, and you also want to do a Flipgrid at the end, like what Randy and I had planned, then it's like, can those integrate together so it's not always sending out a separate link? So that's what we were trying today. And I think just like anything else, if once you practice it, once you set it up, then it's pretty easy. But it's just that initial setup first.
Okay. As you continue to experiment, I'm going to go ahead and go back to our main presentation here today. So you don't have to go anywhere. But as we quickly approach the bottom of the hour, we want to make sure we honor your time and make some space for some questions and answers here as well. So our feedback survey, so as we move toward our closure here, that's the slide I kind of glossed over, but we're closing our time here together. Our feedback survey today, for those of you joining us live, should come up to you in Zoom as soon as you exit our meeting here. We use those feedback surveys to track your attendance in the sessions. That's the best record we have that you were here and were an active participant. And part of those feedback surveys is the exit ticket you see down below. Pear Deck is also asking you for a response just to help you jog your memory, and so you have a record of that thinking as you go forward. And the exit ticket is what other strategies might be helpful to promote metacognition and what situations might you use them in. So as always, when we are done with our session here today and we close the Pear Deck session, you'll get a copy of these slides sitting for you and waiting in your inbox shortly after our time here today. With that said, we are nearing the bottom of the hour. I do appreciate your time and your thinking here today. I want to turn it over to Anissa for any parting thoughts she might have to offer before we get ready to depart for the day, and as well as open up to any questions and answers that you folks might have as well.
Great, thank you. No, thank you guys again, as always, for being here. We appreciate it and appreciate your engagement with it and with the thinking. If you have any questions, please feel free at this point to unmute yourself and ask. So we love that you're here. We hope everybody's staying safe. depending on where you're at, depends on how many different natural disasters are going on around you. So take care of yourselves. And next week we have our webinar is going to be around applications that we can use with the kids in terms of engagement, in terms of pushing their thinking.
The link I posted there in chat will take you directly to your Pear Deck slides as well. Again, thank you all for being here. No obligation to stay with us any later unless you have any questions for us. We look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thanks, and have a great evening, guys.